Salut, you are listening to The Spark. This is a podcast produced by Youth for Democratic Renewal for purposes of going to the heart of the matter of current events and drawing warranted conclusions.
Spark Radio is sharing a presentation on what to expect with the inauguration of Donald Trump to the presidency of the United States on January 20th. The presentation was delivered by Kathleen Chandler, leader of the U.S. Marxist-Leninist Organization, USMLO, on matters of concern at this time.
President-elect Donald Trump will take office on January 20th, and already the conflicts within the ruling circles are showing themselves, as was just brought out. While it is regularly reported that Trump won the trifecta, as it's put, for governing, meaning what are called the Republicans have the presidency and majority in both the Senate and House of Representatives, the reality is different. The cartel parties do not operate as political parties, but as mafia-like cartels, with alliances changing and factions within them voting according to the private interests they represent and their own self-interests, including future positions in the private oligopolies. Even the Republicans themselves identify 5 different factions among their ranks. This factional fighting was evident yesterday when the new Congress was sworn in. In the House of Representatives, which has 435 members, the split is officially 219 Republicans and 215 Democrats, with 1 current vacancy as Matt Gaetz resigned. He was to be Trump's attorney general, but opposition even before the new Congress was seated was such that he was forced to withdraw. The Senate is 53-47. The first act of the new House of Representatives is to elect the Speaker of the House, as was just mentioned. No activity can take place without that. So Mike Johnson of Louisiana, considered one of the most conservative representatives, was the House Speaker for the last Congress and ran again for the new Congress. The vote's done by roll call, meaning each representative has to stand up and say who they vote for. And they can vote for anyone they want to. And the Speaker does not even have to be a member of the House, although they always have been. And a simple majority is needed to win, which in this case would be 218. A representative can also simply vote present. Trump, who had previously threatened Johnson and opposed him for this vote, supported him in the days before the vote. And Trump's incoming White House Chief of Staff, Susie Wiles, also called members directly to whip up support for Johnson. Steve Bannon, Trump's former Chief of Staff, also did so, and he put forward what their view is, which is Johnson was the least offensive and there's no alternative. So this is some of the difficulties they face of even bringing forward a champion to be their House Speaker. Even so, Johnson scrambled to get enough votes yesterday with about a dozen holdups. On the first round of voting, Johnson did not secure the majority, as all 215 of those in what we can call the Biden, Harris, Obama, Clinton factions voted for Hakeem Jeffries, their candidate, and he's the minority leader in the House, and 3 people from among the Republican factions voted against it, which was enough to block the election. Demands during the course of all this were openly made for deals such as chairmanship of important committees like the Foreign Affairs, Appropriations, and the Rules Committee, which is in a position to block legislation from getting to the floor. The initial vote against Johnson was a means for these various factions to show their ability to block him and signal to Trump as well. While it is reported that Johnson only made pledges, the openness of the dealing and level of corruption was evident before Congress even begins to address legislation. And a number of those that voted for Johnson threatened in an open letter circulated while the vote was going on that they would not support him in the future if more cuts are not made to the budget and the debt lowered and similar demands. Some of their demands are not the same as Trump's agenda. This particular election is more significant than previous fights over the Speaker, which erupted after the 2022 elections and took 15 votes to resolve. As I mentioned, without a Speaker, the House cannot act and Trump cannot be certified as winner of the election on January 6th. So Trump forcefully intervened and basically strong-armed the 2 people involved to get them to change their votes, and Johnson was elected on the second round of voting. However, it remains clear that the factional fighting and shifting of alliances will continue. Leading up to this fight, Trump and Elon Musk intervened to make demands concerning the deal reached just hours before yet another government shutdown, December 20th. Trump and Musk demanded that the debt ceiling be raised as part of the deal. He intervened after a tentative deal had been reached by Johnson and others, forcing more maneuvering. But in this case, Trump and Musk lost, with close to 40 representatives voting down the deal that he pushed with the debt ceiling included. And it had to be removed to pass a resolution that prevented the shutdown, but only until March 14th. So this inability to pass a budget is one of the things that people are most angry about. It's one of the main jobs that Congress has, and it continually is unable to do so other than for passing the Pentagon budget. And the old notions that a majority by one party meant control and an easy ability to pass legislation is no longer the case, as the alliances and factions shift, and so do the votes. This is also a factor increasing executive actions by the president, including greater use of police powers. Worst case scenarios also involve efforts to eliminate any will for Congress, which is already very discredited, and people are angry and dissatisfied with its total dysfunction. This is especially true when it comes to budget matters and issues of war and war funding on the part of the people. But it's an issue, if Congress fails, that the executive could intervene, justify intervention on. And the debt ceiling is one example. It sets a limit to the amount of debt the US government can have, and thus the amount of funds it can borrow. It has particular significance to Trump, as a failure to raise it would mean the government would default, greatly impacting its financial standing and credibility. It is also where the factions tend to sharply show themselves, which undermines his control. Trump is pushing to keep the US dollar dominant in international trade, where the dollar is required for trade in oil, for example, and more generally as a reserve. A default weakens the dollar. Part of his threats coming into the presidency are against the BRICS countries of Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and also Egypt and Iran and others are joining. He said, quote, "We require a commitment from these countries that they will neither create a new BRICS currency nor back any other currency to replace the mighty US dollar, or they will face 100% tariffs." The debt ceiling was reinstated January 1st after having been suspended June 2nd in 2023. It is currently at just over $36.1 trillion, up from $31.4 trillion in June. And while there are sufficient funds to meet government payments immediately, Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen sent a letter to the congressional leaders yesterday saying that the U.S. is not expected to reach the limit where it has no funds left until sometime between January 14th and January 23rd. So Trump is demanding that Congress act on this before January 20th. He doesn't want it to interfere with his activities, but that doesn't look likely. So we'll see how that's another one of these scenarios that can develop in the situation. After Yellen said that the Treasury Department can still take extraordinary measures to prevent a default for a few more months. And the Senate, in this period now between January 6th and January 20th, when Trump takes office, has to approve Trump's cabinet appointments in this basic timeframe, which is another arena of contention, as the removal of Getz before nominations were even considered brings out. Looks like they will begin with the Department of Defense, and there's already a lot of opposition to the person that he's chosen. How these battles play out and how Trump contends with them will not only show the level of factional fighting and the inability of current governing arrangements to contend with them, it will also indicate how Trump plans to break the bounds of the Constitution and congressional authority when it comes especially to budgetary matters, including the debt ceiling, which could be eliminated altogether. Also keep in mind that tariffs and sanctions can be imposed by the executive without congressional approval, one of the reasons Trump repeatedly threatens their use. In terms of worst case scenarios, one of the main areas Trump will use to break the bounds of the Constitution is that of immigration, including imposing mass deportations and use of military inside the country. Both aim to lessen the role and authority of the state authorities, who, it must be remembered, are themselves highly armed and have their own National Guard military forces and state, county, and local police forces. Places like New York City, Chicago, and Los Angeles all have their own armies with command centers, drones, tanks, helicopters, automatic weapons, etc. Confronting states on this matter and confronting the broad protests that are already occurring are a means to justify use of the military inside the country and provide conditions for emergency actions like martial law or military rule in some form. And that is also possible at the time of the inauguration. If it's brought forward that there's too much of a protest, they are already talking about how they're going to contend with it, given what happened January 6, 2021. Breaking the bounds of the Constitution are not to meet the needs of the present, which demand empowerment of the people, but rather to preserve the US state in conditions where the existing government arrangements have failed. Trump has already sent his border czar, Tom Homan, to Texas and New York City as part of demands for increasing federal authority. Texas is being used as a model, as the governor there supports increased militarization and has already stationed Texas National Guard along the border. Texas has also offered public land for use of a detention center. Keep in mind that generally the people Trump targets for deportation will first have to be detained and then deported, which means far more detention camps are needed. And those come under federal authority, not state authority. As well, while previously there was an agreement with Mexico to accept people being deported, even if they were not Mexican nationals, the Mexican government is now saying they will no longer do so. This means that people would have to be sent to their home country, wherever that might be, which would require air transport on a massive scale. This too then is a place where Trump could justify use of the military not only on the border, but to intervene in Mexico and force her to accept the people being deported in the name of national security and border security. So this question of targeting Mexico and invading is as was raised, openly being talked about at this point, and not only by Trump, but by those he's also planning to appoint. His Secretary of State from Florida is in favor of doing that and using special forces and these sorts of things. His threats concerning tariffs against Mexico and Canada should be taken seriously, as part of Trump's role in preserving the US state is preserving and extending its domination internationally. The US needs to more fully integrate Mexico under its military and war machine, and Trump is using immigration and border issues as a means to do this. The threats are also to strengthen US control over Canada, which is evident in the current push concerning a North American Arctic, and more generally, greater control over both Mexico, Canada, their natural resources and labor. It's all for the war machine and war preparations. While the US has been developing this for some time, what stands out with the Trump presidency is the likelihood of increased use of the military and using border issues and immigration to justify that use inside the country and against Mexico and Canada. What gets left out in these calculations are the firm stand of the people in all three countries against these actions. For Canada and Mexico, there is the striving for self-reliant economies free of the US war machine and dictate. And in the US too, the demands for anti-war, pro-social economy and government. Already many actions have taken place in the US defending the rights of immigrants and refugees. These include demands to eliminate the main federal enforcement agency, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE. In California, for example, which has both sanctuary cities and the state is a sanctuary state, mass actions occurred in December demanding that ICE not be allowed in the state and no funds used to assist federal enforcement. Similar actions have occurred in New York and Chicago and elsewhere. The firm stand remains that these planned deportations, detentions, separation of families, removing workers long apart of the US working class and playing their militant role are not in our name and not in our communities. As part of weakening state authority, Trump has also said he will arrest local and state authorities that refuse to comply with federal authorities. He's specifically targeting these sanctuary states and cities, which exist across the country and reflects the strong demand of the people to respect and defend immigrant and refugee rights. These sanctuaries specifically block use of federal authorities, ICE, especially to detain people, so they could not carry out the plan for the detention and deportation. And they are extensive, these sanctuary areas. So scenarios are already being painted of Trump sending in thousands of troops to be used in places like New York City or Los Angeles or Chicago or Denver and elsewhere to round up people branded as criminal or without documents, despite the sanctuary status. These are means not only to weaken state and local level laws and authority, but to, again, provide conditions for potential emergency measures, greater police powers, and even moving towards military rule. There are also already many actions and demonstrations not only to defend immigrant refugee rights, but also those in support of Palestine, against war, and for the rights of workers. On January 1st, New York City saw thousands demonstrate in Times Square, upholding the red line against genocide and demanding an arms embargo against Israel. Demonstrations are also occurring in Washington, D.C., calling on Congress not to certify Trump as president, saying he committed insurrection in January 6, 2021, and therefore cannot be president. These demonstrators were forced from the Capitol grounds, where they initially planned to take action, and were forced instead to go to the Lincoln Monument. And while relying on the Constitution's 14th Amendment, which elaborates this content on insurrection, they are reflective of the anger with the dysfunctional arrangements and the lack of a means to hold government to account. Actions are also planned for Trump's inauguration, January 20th. Anti-war forces have organized webinars to denounce U.S. actions in Palestine, Lebanon, and Syria, and will no doubt be present January 20th, as will those defending the right to speech and to organize. We can anticipate a big police presence in this situation, but people are preparing to deal with that and are defiant in making sure that actions do take place on January 20th and after. Workers also organized for rights in 2024 and are doing so in 2025. 5,000 nurses and doctors in Portland, Oregon, for example, have called for a strike January 10th. Healthcare workers are among those most active, demanding to deal with staffing shortage, the question of needing more staff to properly prepare for their patients and to provide the healthcare that's required. So there was also a 3-day strike by more than 50,000 healthcare workers in California that was joined by those demonstrating in support of Palestine. 10,000 nurses unionized in Detroit, while nearly 28,000 school employees in Virginia, which is a right to work, or we call it a right to be enslaved state, also unionized. At the first Southern auto plant to organize in years, Volkswagen in Chattanooga, Tennessee, 5,000 workers won a union in April with a vote of 73%. East Coast port workers also went on strike, secured a significant wage increase and more. They too, like those on the West Coast, have respected picket lines to block shipments to Israel by those opposing genocide in Gaza. And this is a tactic that can be expected to be increased in the coming year. Boeing workers are also secured wage and other gains. At Daimler Truck in North Carolina, 7,400 workers threatened to strike and defeated tiers and won a 25% increase. And there were more than 34 strikes in just the manufacturing sector and many other actions in the various other sectors. So, for example, after a vigorous contract campaign, so a lot of what takes place is a big fight before the contract expires as a threat that the workers are well organized and to gain public support. The American Airlines had a 99.5% strike vote, and then they secured an immediate 20% pay increase, back pay, and what they call boarding pay for the first time, so that they start getting paid when boarding is happening, not when the door closes. Southwest flight attendants won wage gains as well, and United flight attendants voted 99.9% to strike, and they still may do so. These struggles, the ongoing demonstrations in support of Palestine, the firm stands in defense of immigrant and refugee rights, are all indications that people in the U.S. are increasing their organized resistance, refusing to submit to U.S. plans for more war and repression. The workers are standing united and rejecting attempts to divide them on a racist basis and attempting to line them up behind Trump and his efforts. The broad collective consciousness among the people, including those who voted for Trump, is that existing arrangements have failed beyond repair. There's broad anger, especially with the impunity and lack of accountability, and anticipation of greater repression and silencing of resistance. There's little support for the notions that the Constitution will solve problems when it has not done so for more than 200 years and is recognized as a compromise with slavery and oligopoly against democracy. For many, this is bringing to the fore the need for a new constitution, one that meets the needs of the time to empower the people to govern and decide all the issues that affect them, especially these matters of war and peace and militarization of the economy and life. Conditions are such that people are looking for alternatives, which presents an important opportunity for us to continue to target these arrangements based on covenant thesis, which puts in place a person of state ruling above and against the people. It is well known that government is for and by the rich, but there is a block to recognizing the need to not replicate these arrangements by putting in place better representatives, but the need for new arrangements that in both form and content empower the people, something a new constitution would address. It means contending with demands, for example, to eliminate the Electoral College or have a direct vote for president, both of which would strengthen the position of the presidency and executive powers. It also means providing confidence and enthusiasm for all those fighting. There's great pressure now here in the States to condemn people of the US for Trump's election, to brand them as racist and reactionary, while also promoting the notion that it is Trump and the US state that decides what takes place and we can only react. One of the actions we took was to send a New Year's greeting that emphasized that it is the people who are the makers of history and the resistance is scoring successes. That we in the US can take pride in the resistance that has been organized, the red line against genocide, and stepping up the fight for rights. We decide how to organize, not Trump. And the response was positive. People very much appreciated lifting this pressure on the people and the upbeat and positive stand. And they responded also by speaking of various ways to join the organizing and how better to develop it. This is just a small example, but it speaks to the significance of our role to strengthen the defiance against US dictate and demands and pursue our own agenda that is anti-war, pro-social, and for the empowerment of the people. Thank you.
This ends today's show. Come back to us for the next broadcast. The easiest way is to follow us on our Facebook page. You will find it under the name Youth for Democratic Renewal. Go like our page, our publications, and above all, broadcast our programs among your comrades, your friends, and your acquaintances. You can also contact us by email at ydr.jrd@gmail.com. Goodbye and see you soon. The Spark is a podcast produced by Youth for Democratic Renewal. All our broadcasts are royalty-free and for educational purposes. The songs that we use in our broadcast are used following the principles of fair dealing and fair use.